the universe is creativity. So we are the unspooling of the creative dynamics of galaxies. Creativity is part of our birthright. Creativity is integral to who we are as beings in this cosmos. We think we understand something when we break it down to its parts. That is an important mode of understanding, but it's not the only mode of understanding. We also have to understand things holistically. We need to understand that nickel and iron and gold and cadmium and carbon can also come together and write poetry, can also come together and create whales, that have these song cycles with 16 different parts that repeat.
Hello, welcome back. Thank you to Adroy Data, who considerably upped their patronage after being moved by a recent episode. And I also want to share some lovely stories of patrons meeting up and creating together. The community is alive, and I would love for you to be part of this. Head to our website, click on community, and become a monthly patron. If you love this podcast, are moved by it, and are learning anything, please support us in making it. Today's episode is all about creativity, which is a theme that's very important to me, and I believe our future. Everything we have in our world now has been created by nature or by us humans. And humans have this wonderful way of both creating the solutions we need to our challenges and creating words and art that stirs our souls. My guest today is Drew Dellinger, PhD, who's an internationally known speaker, poet, writer, and teacher, whose keynotes and poetry performances, which address ecology, justice, cosmology, and connectedness, have inspired minds and hearts around the world. He is also a consultant, filmmaker, and founder of Planetize the Movement. These words from his poem Hieroglyphic Staircase are haunting. It's 3:23 in the morning, and I can't sleep, because my great-great-grandchildren ask me in dreams, what did you do while the earth was unraveling? Drew has presented at over 1,400 events across the US, UK, Canada, and Australia. He's spoken and performed at numerous conferences, including TED Women, Pioneers, the Green Festival, The Dream Reborn, and the Parliament of the World's Religions, as well as colleges and universities, poetry venues, protests, and places of worship. As a consultant, Drew was a core developer and designer of the Pachamama Alliance's Awakening the Dreamer Symposium, now used in 80 countries in 18 languages. Drew holds a PhD in philosophy and religion and has taught and lectured at numerous colleges and universities around the US. He's been called a national treasure by Joanna Macy, a deep and courageous poet by Alice Walker, and one of the most creative, courageous, and prophetic voices of his generation by Cornel West. In this conversation, we explore the question, what is the role of creativity in our times? I hope that you enjoy this beautiful conversation, which took place at Drew's house near Muir Woods in Marin County. Welcome to The Future is Beautiful, with me, your host, Amisha Gadiali. On this show, we explore the weave between politics, spirituality, creativity, and sustainability. It's time for us to move beyond silos and into an integrated way of being. Every one of us has ideas and personal experiences to share that can lead us to a brighter future. This is the revolution. Despite the challenges we face as a global community or the pressures that we meet in our daily lives, when we stop and dare to dream, to ask ourselves the big questions, and to share what we are already doing, we create the future that we wish to wake up for. That future is beautiful. Drew, I am delighted to be here with you in your living room in Marin and to invite you onto The Future is Beautiful. Welcome to the show.
Oh, thank you. I'm so excited to enjoy this conversation with you.
I wonder if you want to start us off with a poem so that our lovely community listening can just get straight into your world.
Sure. This is a short poem that kind of reminds me of some of the themes that you're dealing with in this podcast. This is called Revision. Open your eyes. See visions. Imagine a melody infinitely. Listen. A planet of stories with islands of silence. A planet of stories with islands of silence. Her curved surface radiates grace. Milky Way blazing in the sky above the city. Speaking in fractals, the stars are telepathic. Wake the poets. Wake the dreamers. Cultivate the tendrils in the vineyard of your heart. Reorient our buildings to the solstice, and from the center of the city, see the stars.
Beautiful. Thank you. What do you feel is the role of poetry in this time? There's a lot of talk at the moment of this particular moment that we're in, this great turning. And in some ways, there's a kind of panic of where we're at right now. And then there's also this kind of speeding up and this heavy on the distraction and the kind of, the quick fire of responses and words. Yeah, I'm curious, in amongst that setting that we find ourselves in, what poetry means for you and what it means for the world.
I'm not sure that the role of poetry is much different than it always has been, though I do think some of the challenges are more intense and urgent. The role of poetry, it's a big question, and I hesitate to give these grand pronouncements about the role of this type of thing, but I think I can certainly share some thoughts. I just think poetry is like the universe, is like a human being, is like a flower, is like a galaxy, is like a star. It's so complex that any kind of pronouncements about this is what it is, it's much more mysterious than that. But I think I think some of the ways in which poetry is integral to the human experience is that it calls us back to ourselves, and it calls us to a deeper experience of our existence in the world. It's integral to the human project. I mean, the human, in a very profound sense, is a self-reflecting entity in the universe. And this is kind of language from my teacher, Thomas Berry, who was an ecological and cosmological thinker and author and teacher. But he would talk about how the human is the space in which the universe reflects on and celebrates itself. And, it's like every phenomenon in the universe is reflecting the cosmos itself, and celebrating. So the whales and the phytoplankton and the oxygen and the rainforests and the birds and the thunderstorms. Thomas Berry, my great mentor, saw all these as the universe celebrating itself. He said, what is the universe? It's celebration. The birds sing, the flowers bloom, the rivers flow, the stars shine, all an ecstatic celebration. And so I think poetry and all of the arts are ways in which the human, in its particular manifestation, celebrates itself. But there is also a role of the human in not just celebrating, but reflecting on. We have this special capacity. It's not absolutely unique. I mean, there may be other species such as dolphins and orangutans and gorillas and many other creatures that self-reflect. And I think we barely are scratching the surface of knowing the consciousness of plants and Gaia and all these species. So I don't want to be, too presumptuous and have this kind of human hubris. So they may be self-reflecting as well. But we know for sure that the human has this profound capacity for self-reflection. So I think of the arts and poetry in a very, primordially in a very cosmological context, that it is a human manifestation of the universe reflecting on and celebrating itself. But in terms of like this particular moment, as you mentioned, I do think there's a way in which poetry can call us into our hearts, call us back to the essence of some of these cosmological questions and quandaries of what does it mean to be a human being, and are we here to maximize wealth and profit for corporations and billionaires, or are we maybe here to engage in the joyful mysteries of existence? You see, so I think all of these, the arts in particular, kind of cut to the quick and sink us into our hearts and the depths of our souls in a way that I think can be very useful and can be very profound in terms of social movements and transformations of consciousness. So I think there's a way in which the arts can reveal the absurdities of racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, ableism, classism, these type of things. So I think the arts do play and have always played an important role in social justice movements, in ecological and other kinds of transformations of consciousness. You know, I talk about in this time we need to build movements that connect ecology, social justice, and cosmology or worldview. And that some of the powerful ways to build those movements are by using the power of dream, the power of story, the power of art, and the power of action. So I do see the arts as integral to the kinds of movement building and transformations of consciousness that so many of us are engaged in and feeling the need for. But I also just think that the arts are just very, in a very simple and joyful sense, just part of deepening our experience and our celebration of being part of the creativity of the universe. I mean, that's, again, the last thing I'll say on this right now is that the universe is creativity. Thomas Berry said we can, a one word synonym for the universe is celebration, but I also think we could say a one word synonym for the universe is creativity. So we are the unspooling of the creative dynamics of galaxies. And so I think creativity is part of our birthright. Creativity is integral to who we are as beings in this cosmos. Therefore, I think creativity plays a very central role to kind of how I envision the future. Can we move away from capitalist occupations and consumerism that's chewing up the biosphere? And well, if we're not at work all day in a capitalist corporatist setting, then what are we going to be doing all day? How about self-cultivation? How about the arts of community? How about creativity at all levels for all people? You know, someone said it's not that the artist is a special kind of person, but every person is a special kind of artist. So, you know, what if we had a guaranteed annual income or a universal basic income where our fundamental needs were met and we could focus on ecological restoration? We could focus on community building and creativity. So Thomas Berry said creativity is the key to human energies. And I would add that I think creativity in many ways is the key to human happiness, that we're most fulfilled when we're engaging and able to express our innate creativity.
Yeah, I feel that too in my own experience, and also the when we look around, like everything has been created by humans. Everything that we come to know, whether it's the table or a book or, you know, the design of a house or a street lamp, whatever it is, it's all been created. And so if more of us are given that space, because it does require some space in order to go into the depths of our inner world to find what wants to be shared and revealed, or to find what spurs of creativity we can catch and be the carriers or the vessels of just what is possible if more and more of us have that time and space, and that ability to go deeper into our creativity. Because sometimes, unfortunately, it's seen as kind of indulgent.
Right.
And the way that the capitalist world operates then also there comes in this notion of privilege of who gets time and space to go and spend a day walking through the trees, listening for a poem. And I don't think that's always been the case, and it probably isn't the case now. It's also partly to do with which poems we get to see.
Yeah, right.
Because I'm pretty sure there are incredible songs and poems that would never be published in a book or would find their way onto a podcast or something that are being created right now that we would all benefit from being able to experience.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think you're touching on some very important issues and dynamics. We could talk about the democratization of creativity, and how it's been, and the same with education. I mean, too. Yeah, there's, these traditions of outsider art, and what's considered, what kind of art is held up in museums. And it's, traditionally not been the art of women, the art of working class people, the art of different marginalized communities. So I think there's many different levels and layers of privilege and elitism and democratization. And then you're talking about the kind of quietness that it takes to sink into our creativity, to engage with it. That's part of why I think of creativity and spirituality in very similar terms. I think creativity is very spiritual, that it's very much connected to these traditions of mysticism. And you look at like a tradition like the haiku tradition in Japanese poetry, it's about the haiku. There's a book with the title "The Haiku Moment." The haiku moment is a moment of interbeing, a moment of interconnectedness, a moment of breaking down the kind of traditional Western, particularly modern dualism of I am a subject and the world is an object, and like I perceive the world out there. It's like that subject-object dualism, as it's sometimes called, dissolves in the haiku moment. And so creativity is very much about dissolving these boundaries that separate us from the world, that lock us into our mind, that lock us into this modern conception that I'm an individuated, as Alan Watts said, the skin encapsulated ego. When we have these mystical moments, when we have these moments of connection or revelation or epiphany or creativity, it's often about a dissolution of that subject-object dualism into a moment of intersubjective communion, right? And then we're getting into connections between that kind of mysticism and social justice or ecological justice. I mean, the Catholic monk Thomas Merton said something along the lines of the whole idea of compassion is based on a keen awareness of the interdependence of all these living beings that are all part of one another and all involved in each other. So this is, you see how it's before we started, you're talking about, moving past silos, but like we can't even get a few minutes into a conversation without recognizing the connections between mysticism, creativity, social justice, ecological healing. I mean, these categories are just splashing into each other.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I find it strange that we've categorized things so much.
Yeah.
When clearly it's all about being human and it is all interrelated.
Yeah, it was. I'm particularly struck by a couple of quotes from Gandhi, where he said, because the whole spectrum of humanity's activities are so interrelated that it's impossible to separate economics, law, politics, religion, justice into these separate categories. And he said, I could not be living a religious life unless I took part in politics. And those who say religion has nothing to do with politics do not know what the word religion means. So I think some of these, thinkers that are crossing these boundaries are calling us to do the same as well.
It's also connected to the capitalism and that the things have to have like a market, so then they need a label.
Yeah.
And you need to know which part of the bookshop the book's going to go on, or whatever
Right.
it is.
Right.
And so you get put in a silo, in a category. And yeah, I don't know, I feel like this time of being alive is about saying, like, no, I'm not going to be siloed. Like, I am interested in the interweave. When I listen to my soul, when I share something from the depths of my soul, like, it doesn't know about these silos.
Right.
It doesn't know about these categories.
Yeah, and of course that's been the trend in academia for decades and decades and maybe centuries, is to have these separate specialized disciplines. When we look back to some of the kind of approach before the modern world, we see, often it's not uncommon to read about someone from hundreds of years ago, and they were a farmer and a poet and an alchemist and a printer and a cabinet maker, and this sort of thing. But the trend in academia, particularly in recent decades, has been very much toward specialization. And these, academia is based on silos. It's a conglomeration of silos, and we call that the university. But whereas interdisciplinarity is a whole, more recent trend in academia. But the fact that there had to be a movement toward, a multi-discipline approach is indicative of the ways in which, and academia, academia is a kind of a weird word for it, but this is the structures of how we bring our children into the universe. For when obviously capitalism and corporatism has very much captured a lot of the universities, but this other problem of, and that's a very modern problem, this kind of one of my other teachers, Matthew Fox, would talk about the Newtonian parts mentality. The same way that we perceive the ecosystem, these organic wholes that are ecosystems, that are our bodies, that are our communities, that are our planet and our solar system and our galaxy. These are all wholes nested within holes. These are, holistic communities. But very much the modern world has been this Newtonian parts mentality, as Matt Fox puts it. So I think part of what we're seeing in this kind of new-ish, it's both new and old. So, but it's new in the sense of it's new to a modern Western culture that has been very focused on separation and individuation and hyper-individualism. There's this sense. Part of what my teacher, Tom Berry, used to say is, we think we understand something when we break it down to its parts. And so if we break down your body and we see that it's composed of iron and nickel and carbon, and now we understand it. Now we really understand it because we've broken it down into its constituent parts. Well, that is an important mode of understanding, but it's not the only mode of understanding. As Thomas Berry would say, we also have to understand things holistically. We need to understand that nickel and iron and gold and cadmium and carbon can also come together and write poetry, can also come together and create whales, that have these song cycles with 16 different parts that repeat. So, we don't understand. It's like, now we understand things because we've broken it down into the elements. Well, we also need to understand that those elements that are born in the hearts of stars can make love and paint paintings and build temples and write haiku.
The alchemy.
Yes.
The unseen alchemy.
Yeah, that's a beautiful phrase.
What I love is that I found when hosting workshops and retreats, I'm sure this is what you've experienced too, that anyone can write and create and share a poem. And often people come in, no, I can't.
Yes.
That's not me. I'm here to listen. And that experience of actually just like, no, like, here's the space and here's the time. Just give it a go and see what happens. And I'm always so moved by the profound depth or the humor or whatever it is that arises in such short spaces of time when that intention's set and when that empowerment to connect to that part of ourselves is there.
Absolutely. Absolutely. It reminds me of this Jack Kerouac quote. There's something along the lines of, "You're a genius all the time." And then we have this, people are so damn brilliant and so creative and so clever. I forget who it was that told this story, but it just breaks my heart. They did this thing, they went into like a second grade, what we in the States would call a second grade classroom. And they said, well, who here can sing? Every hand went up. And who here can dance? Every hand went up. Who here can paint or draw? Every hand went up. Then they go into a sixth or seventh or eighth grade classroom. Who here can sing? Two hands go up. Who here can dance? One hand goes. You see what I'm saying? Mm-hmm. It's like somehow this process of socialization and these processes of education are divorcing us from our innate brilliance and creativity and confidence. That's part of the unlearning that we need to recover from. We need to recover from this modern socialization and education that separates us from our own brilliance and creativity and the joy of that and the freedom of that and the self-confidence that that is our right.
For sure. Absolutely. So for one of our friends listening that is feeling that stirring in their belly right now, listening to us talk, and is also feeling that fear and all the voices saying, no, not you. They're talking about somebody else.
Right.
What would you suggest for them to do right now? Well, maybe after they've listened to the whole conversation, or maybe they need to press pause and come back to it later.
Yeah, right. Yes, please do. If you're feeling the stirring, press pause right now. Well, I would say, that it's okay to dip your toe in. You don't have to go from 0 to 60 in 2 seconds. And so I would suggest some small steps to get into creativity. If one is feeling like that's a big step, get a notebook, carry a pen and a piece of paper. I would sometimes, if I was going out for the evening, just put a pen in my back pocket, because I've realized over the years that it's much, much, much easier to find a little scrap of paper to write on than to find a pen, when an idea strikes. But ideally and sometimes I would even just take one loose piece of paper, fold it into quarters and put it in my back pocket, just in case. That's the kind of, it can be a small step, but make a commitment to your own creativity. Take it serious. You don't have to be grim about it, but take it serious in the sense that you have something to say, you have ideas, and ideas are flowing through us all the time. You were talking earlier about how it's kind of a receiving process. Let me finish this first thought, which is, the writer Anne Lamott said, if you don't carry around a pen and a piece of paper, then God gives your ideas to somebody else. And that's what I mean about just taking your own creativity seriously. Don't let God give your ideas to somebody else. Carry around a pen and a piece of paper and write these things down. And don't judge them so much. I've got things in my notebook that I would be embarrassed for people to see, but I also know, like the classic line from Spinal Tap is that there's a fine line between clever and stupid. If you write something down and you say, oh, well, that's stupid, you don't know. Don't be so judgmental. Don't be so harsh. There's a fine line between clever and stupid, and something that you write down that you think, oh, well, that's just silly, that's just stupid, that can actually turn into something clever, but not if you don't write it down. You see, these things can evolve. Your journal, your notebook is like a garden. It's like an evolutionary ecosystem where things can take place. You can write down a rhyme and think, oh, that's silly. I would never in 100 years can conceive of exactly how I would use that rhyme. But that sometimes I'll write down a rhyme. I write down a word and then a slash and then the word that rhymes with it. And I've got notebooks full of these silly things. Or I will just write down one word. This is part of what I mean. So that was the first tip is, get a pen and a piece of paper, carry it around, put one next to your, on your bedside table, this sort of thing. Because of course, often creativity, again, this gets back into the mystical, spiritual aspects of creativity, but I kind of collect stories of important breakthroughs that come in dreams. Gandhi's first time he thought of doing a nationwide hartal, or a kind of a day of prayer and fasting, it came to him from a dream. He emerged from the dream space with that idea of a nationwide hartal. The song Yesterday by Paul McCartney came to him in a dream. it was so familiar to Paul that he walked around all day playing it for people and saying, like, what song is this? This has got to be a song, that somebody wrote. And people kept saying, like, no.
I think you've just written
I think you've just written it, and it's really damn good. And the same thing with the opening riff to Satisfaction. Keith Richards, I mean, hell, he was probably drunk or something, but he woke up in the middle of the night. He rolled over in bed and he hit record on this tape, a little tape recorder he had next to his bed, and he played the opening riff to Satisfaction. And when he woke up in the morning, he had completely forgotten that he had done this. He was just about to rewind the tape and record over it and erase it forever, but he noticed that there was a little bit of space at the tape where something might have been recorded, and he went back and listened to it, and it was the opening riff of Satisfaction. I mean, there's dozens and dozens of stories like this. So absolutely keep a pen and a piece of paper next to your bedside table and write down these thoughts. And sometimes it's just a word. I remember writing the word confluence in my journals and being like, that's a cool word. It has a nice sound, a nice kind of combination of vowels and syllables and confluence. But it also is a concept, of course, where things come together. I remember writing down the word equidistant, being like, that's a cool word too. Again, a nice combination of vowels and consonants, nice sounds in the word. But there's also a cool concept, equidistant, to be exactly halfway in between one thing and the other. I mean, I've got, this is kind of a silly example, but and some things can turn into something different years and years later. I remember I was on a hiking trip in the canyonlands of Utah. Southern Utah is just stunning. You've got these sandstone canyons, and you've probably seen pictures of these slot canyons that are so narrow you can put one arm, you can span these 100-foot canyons with their arms, and they're sculpted by the wind. You've probably seen some of these magnificent pictures. But we were hiking for the day. We'd have to break up into different hiking groups, and we would say, okay, well, we're going to meet. Let's all meet for lunch at the confluence of Fish Canyon and Owl Creek Canyon. So yeah, we'll meet. We're looking at the map in the morning. We'll say, your group go first. We'll follow along, but we'll meet for lunch at the confluence of these two canyons. And I didn't even think about that consciously. And 10 years later, I wrote a poem that begins, let's meet at the confluence where you flow into me and one breath swirls between our lungs. Let's meet at the confluence where you flow into me and one breath swirls between our lungs. You see how I took this silly episode where we were planning our hiking routes and turned it into poetry 10 years later? So that's what I mean when I say don't judge, just write down things that strike your fancy. But also, there's a kind of an input-output equation. Engage in reading. Read poetry if you're interested in poetry. Go to art museums and look at paintings if you're in it. Take a class, go to an open mic or a poetry slam. These things will often stimulate our creativity, so we can stimulate our interior life by, exposing ourselves to the creative expressions that are out there in the world.
Yeah, and nature being another one.
Absolutely.
Just looking at creation and
absolutely
how that tree has formed or whatever it is, and getting inspiration there. It's like, as you're talking, I feel like, as we talk about sustainability and ecology, and and a lot of it is around waste, and I know that one of the areas that I am the most wasteful is actually in my creativity, because I feel like I only pay attention to 20 or 30% of actually the fully formed pieces that come into my inner space, because I don't pick out the pen and the paper, or I think I'll remember it, and it's like, I just kind of got this connection as you're speaking of, it's kind of like one of the ways for us to like not be wasteful and be resourceful and regenerative in this time is to not waste the creativity, and to almost see the responsibility. And I don't mean that in like a heavy way, but
right.
In stewarding whatever it is that comes, and either sharing it at least with yourself, if not with your family, your friends, your community, or the wider world. And I love this notion of how you talk about like God will give your creativity to someone else. And I suppose I see it slightly differently. Like that creativity isn't necessarily mine, but I might get the chance to be the one that brings it in,
right,
if I'm paying enough attention.
right.
One of the members of this project that I run, Presence Collective, which is like a membership site for, say, like for creative, courageous, connected living. And one of the women shared recently that she had never written a poem, maybe not even as a child, through doing various practices that we've been doing in the group, and meditating and journaling a lot, that this sort of sense of awareness and presence was opening up in her. And then she had that experience of literally just like, where's the pen? Where's the paper? And like a fully formed poem came through. And that awareness to like not judge it as well, just to write it, just to receive it, to kind of understand that, yeah, like it comes from somewhere bigger, but it's also, there's an alchemical process happening with your soul or my soul.
Right.
So maybe if there is like, if God or creation or the spirit of the poem is like moving through this room right now, if it landed with you or with me, the alchemy of our souls would create something slightly different with it.
Yes, I really like that you're saying this, because you hear people so often say like, oh, it's not about me, it's totally just flows through me. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, of course.
It's
obviously.
Nice to be humble.
It's very nice to be humble, absolutely. But I was just hearing you hear people say this all the time and just going like, it's outside of us. Oh, I was watching a documentary where Rick Rubin was talking to David Lynch. Rick Rubin's a music producer, was talking to David Lynch, the filmmaker, and they're both very into meditation, or at least for sure David Lynch is. And they were both saying, well, it's outside of us and we receive it. And I'm always feel like, yes, and so I think the way that you've said it really hits the nail on the head, that it's not just, it's like somebody else, like the example of, yes, I do think creativity transcends us. And it certainly transcends our, egoic, mental, rational mind. And I think it comes from the depths of the unconscious. And when we're talking about the depths of the unconscious, yes, we're kind of talking about deep inside us, but the bottom falls out. I mean, this is part of what Jung thought when he talked about the collective unconscious. The deeper you get in, when you go into the unconscious, you're going into the interior. And then the bottom falls out and you're in the cosmos again. You're in the Gaian mind field. And you're in the collective unconscious, which is the cosmos, which is Gaia, which is the creativity of the galaxies. But it is an alchemical process, and I love the way you put it, because that's my kind of problem with people saying, oh, I just receive it and it's a transmission and it has nothing to do with me. Well, it does, because I had that experience of being in the hiking group that said we're going to meet at the confluence of these two canyons, and then some kind of creative inclination or spirit came through me and helped sculpt that into a poem, but it wasn't completely separate from the fact that this individual person, had the experience. So I love the way you put it. I think it's exactly right. There is something very cosmic and transcendent and beyond us about creativity, but there's an alchemical process where it intermingles with our particular personality, our individual experiences. And it's, part of what art is, part of what's powerful about art. They say in writing, it's the details. The details are what make it really salient, and it's the details of each person. One of my teachers, Susan Griffin, has said it's the idiosyncratic moments, that are actually the most universal. And that's why our writers are always saying, use the details. Don't say a car drove by, say 1968 Lincoln Continental with chrome hubcaps and a turquoise pinstripe drove by, and the more we go into, and then, people go like, oh, well, that's just so specific that no one will be able to connect with that. No, it's those details that we connect with. It's those details that are human and relatable. And it's those idiosyncratic moments that actually connect us to the most universal experiences. And people go like, yeah, well, I've never seen a car exactly like that, but what you just gave me is a much more relatable experience than if you had just said a car drove by, or you said something about truth and beauty and goodness. These are abstract categories, but the details are where those transcendent truths become filtered through the portal of the world, right? So like when Dante writes his first book about Beatrice, who is kind of his great spiritual muse, and she represents God, and she represents the Trinity, and she represents Jesus, and she represents the goddess Mary, and she represents divinity. But he also describes her as a real 9-year-old girl that he saw when he was 9 years old in Florence. You see what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm.
So the individual personage of this 9-year-old Florentine girl becomes a portal through which he can make these associations to God, Jesus, divinity, grace. You see what I'm saying? So there's a very intricate and interesting connection between the concrete and the universal, between the specific and the transcendent. And that's part of the mystery of how art and writing operates.
Yeah, and I guess as well as those aspects and the alchemy, there's also the skill and the will as
Right.
well. Because in those examples that you gave, say of Gandhi and of Paul McCartney, if Paul McCartney didn't have a level of musicality and a platform and the confidence, then the whole world would not know that song.
That's right. That's why the feeling's not enough. You have to have a form that allows that feeling to resonate with others. And that's where the discipleship and the dedication and the commitment to craft comes in, because we all have feelings of, heartbreak and loss and sorrow and poignancy and joy and outrage and profound gratitude and sadness. But not all of us can put that into a poem that's going to really move the hearts of others. So the feeling is not enough. One person said a long time ago, I forget who, said, it's like bad writing thinks that the feeling is enough. But good writing knows that the feeling has to find the form that allows that feeling to be activated in other people. So it's not just, every one of us has had all of these spectrum of human emotions, but it takes some time and some discipline and some commitment to craft. That's why I say take a class. That's why I say study writers and poets and go to these poetry slams and stuff. Yes, we all have these feelings, and in an ideal world, we could all sit down from day one and write a poem that would be brilliant and magnificent and touch people. But no, there's craft. There's certain things that touch people. There's ways of using words. There's evocative images. There's the kind of patterns of rhythm and repetition that are integral to poetry. And these are the things that activate that feeling in others. So it's the feeling is not enough in a work of art. You've got to find the form that really gets it over. How you got to get it across to people, as they say in preaching. They say, like, how do you get it over to people? How do you make it plain for people? Yeah.
And there's a balance, right, too, of not being too caught in a process that's happened before.
Yeah.
Because also one aspect of creativity is it can invite something that's never happened before into the world, or
Brilliant.
a new way of doing something, a new way of seeing something.
Yep.
And then if we get caught up in the rules, then we might miss it. So it's this balance, but it's like that balance is unique for each person,
right,
to find. And I guess the other thing that just kind of came to me is this relationship between creativity and activism, between social justice, ecological justice, that when, say, Gandhi had that vision, he also was a lawyer. He also knew how to mobilize people. He also had that skill base. So then there's a place where the creativity and the mysticism and the heartfelt intention can mix with an ability to actually affect the system.
Yes. Mm-hmm. You're right. That's part of why I think the most effective things combine the kind of the heart and the head. combine, what sometimes called left brain and right brain, and this sort of thing. So I think when people say like, oh, we just need the arts to stir people's hearts and then the movement will all come together. It's like, yeah, well, also the arts informed by science, informed by sociology, so I think that there's some of the most powerful things that have the biggest impact on us are not just these freewheeling all heart things, but are actually kind of a combination of reason and emotion, of the head and the heart.
And like the head, heart, and hands.
Yes.
And
absolutely.
So that we can actually take into action as well.
Yep.
Would you like to read us another poem?
Yeah, sure. You bet. Here's a poem called, well, I'll read that poem that I referenced earlier, so you'll recognize the opening lines. This is called Hymn to the Sacred Body of the Universe. Let's meet at the confluence where you flow into me and one breath swirls between our lungs. Let's meet at the confluence where you flow into me and one breath swirls between our lungs, for one instant to dwell in the presence of the galaxies, for one instant to live in the truth of the heart. The poet says this entire traveling cosmos is the secret one, slowly growing a body. Two eagles are mating, clasping each other's claws and turning cartwheels in the sky. Grasses are blooming, grandfathers dying, consciousness blinking on and off. All of this is happening at once. All of this vibrating into existence out of nothingness, every particle foaming into existence, transcribing the ineffable. Every particle foaming into existence, transcribing the ineffable, arising and passing away, arising and passing away, 23 trillion times per second. When Buddha saw that, he smiled. 16 million tons of rain are falling every second on the planet, an ocean perpetually falling, and every drop is your body. Every motion, every feather, every thought is your body. Time is your body. And the infinite, curled inside like invisible rainbows folded into light. Every word of every tongue is love, telling a story to her own ears. Let our lives be incense, burning like a hymn to the sacred body of the universe. My religion is rain. My religion is stone. My religion reveals itself to me in sweaty epiphanies. Every leaf, every river, every animal, your body, every creature trapped in the gears of corporate nightmares. Every species made extinct was once your body. 10 million people are dreaming that they're flying. Junipers and violets are blossoming, stars exploding and being born. God is having deja vu. I am one elaborate crush. We cry petals as the void is singing. We cry petals as the void is singing. You are the dark that holds the stars in intimate distance, that spun the whirling, whirling world into existence. Let's meet at the confluence where you flow into me and one breath swirls between our lungs.
I know that you've been involved for a long time in this kind of space of social justice and creativity here in Northern California. I wonder if you can share some insights around what's been bubbling in community over the years and how it's shifting, and what feels really present now.
Well, I was always drawn toward art and social justice. And so I always admired people who were able to combine those. So like you have the singing group Sweet Honey and the Rock, that was originally kind of grew out of the tradition of the SNCC singers, the Student for Nonviolent Coordinating Committee singers. People like Bob Dylan and Bob Marley, and so many of the great, brilliant artists from the 1960s, Joni Mitchell, people like Ani DeFranco. There's so many examples of artists that, because art is kind of political in its essence, right? It's about freedom and liberation and transcending some of the strictures of what for the last couple thousand years in the West has been a very patriarchal, very hierarchical kind of society. So if the society is patriarchal and hierarchical and racist and colonial and imperialist, then any kind of transcending of that or subverting of that is going to be inherently political. And so part of what the arts do is that they subvert the dominant culture and they bring in this kind of fresh breeze of counterculture and fresh breeze of. So I was always kind of drawn to that kind of artistic, liberatory vibe and creativity. And, I just think that people like Bob Dylan, I meant to say Bob Marley. Bob Dylan, I absolutely adore. But I was thinking in my head of Bob Marley. I think Bob Marley is one of the great arts activists of the 20th century. We could say the same about Nina Simone, Paul Robeson. These, I'm kind of oriented toward the United States, of course, but of course, Bob's from Jamaica, but you get the point. So I always kind of aspired to that kind of confluence of arts and activism. And I think it's very profound and very powerful. And I think the arts have such a immediate and deep effect on us and on our consciousness. In the mid 90s, I became aware of a group here that was started here in San Francisco in 1996 called Art and Revolution. And some of my great mentors like Ali Chagi Star and David Solnit, who were the co-founders of Art and Revolution. And they were, Ali's a great dancer and choreographer, and David is a great kind of artist and painter and puppet maker. And so he was drawing on the tradition. There's a whole tradition of radical puppetry, that goes back to Bread and Roses, I think is the name of this kind of radical puppetry group in the Northeast. And so then I kind of fell in with some of these direct action activists that were, for example, planning to shut down the World Trade Organization meetings in Seattle in 1999. And so I, along with a big group of students, I was teaching at Prescott College in Arizona at the time. And we had a whole crew of about 60 of us that went up from Prescott, Arizona and participated in the direct action shutdown of downtown Seattle, where we disrupted the opening day of meetings of the World Trade Organization ministerial in Seattle in 1999. But we disrupted it with direct action and civil disobedience and physical blockades, where we were using these kind of called lock boxes to bond our arms together and occupy these intersections. But also it was really a creative festival. And if you just watched on the news, you would miss that part. You would see folks, smashing the windows of a Starbucks or the Nike Town store, and you would see police shooting tear gas and using their batons and truncheons to pummel peaceful protesters. But if you were in the streets that day, you saw music. And you saw there was a whole line of students from the Global South and young people from the Global South who were playing drums and had a whole march just snaking through the streets. And you saw people dressed up as Wonder Woman and Superman, and you saw these hilarious signs and this creativity. So we would talk. One of the things we talk about is a festival of resistance. Bringing art and creativity, and you would see rappers, going down the streets on the back of a flatbed truck with these huge, speakers amplifying their rhymes and their verses, and you would see dancers, Ali started a group called Dancers Without Borders. And so they would do these amazing, Naomi Klein talks about, I saw her, this is 10, 15 years ago, but she was talking about two of her transcendent moments in the whole of the global justice movement as Naomi Klein, had experienced it. And one of those moments was a dance that I believe it was Ali's group that had choreographed in the streets of Seattle. And another one of her top two transcendent moments in the global justice movement was a protest that I also was at during the Democratic National Convention in Los Angeles in 2000, where Rage Against the Machine came. And I don't think they had a permit. Maybe they had a permit, maybe they didn't, but it was not a really like a sanctioned concert. It was like we showed up and built a stage in the parking lot outside the Staples Center auditorium where the Democratic National Convention was happening, and Rage Against the Machine played for thousands and thousands and thousands of people right there in the streets, in the parking lot. And those were, and this is Naomi Klein, who's been involved in so much activity in the global justice movement, has had many of, peak moments and tough moments and all that. And the two things that stood out to her as her two transcendent moments in the global justice movement were a dance in Seattle in the streets and a concert by Rage Against the Machine in Los Angeles in the streets. That's the kind of galvanizing soul level power that the arts have. So it was partially inspired by being involved with Art and Revolution and some of this global justice activism that was happening at the time. And also I had been inspired by the political dynamics of hip hop, right? So you had Chuck D and Public Enemy in terms of what we kind of wistfully look back on as the golden age of hip hop. But you had artists like KRS-One, who was saying, what do you mean when you say I'm rebellious? Because I don't accept everything that you're telling us. What are you selling us? The creator dwell in us. I sit in your unknown class while you're failing us. And so I was listening to these type of artists like Public Enemy, like KRS-One, like many of the other political and conscious rappers of the time. And I was saying, it was around that time that I started a little hip hop group with my friends at this small college in Arizona. But we would say to each other, one of our mottos that we would use to inspire ourselves, we would say the rap form is the platform. The rap form is the platform. It's a very powerful palette and a very powerful medium through which to talk about ecological, political, social justice issues. So, and then I kind of evolved into doing spoken word poetry from writing rhymes in college. So very inspired by this whole tradition of arts and activism. And again, you can go back to the civil rights movement and Dr. King and many others will tell you about how integral the music is to the movement. And they would sing together in these churches, 3,000 people joined together singing these songs. Henry David Thoreau once said, when I hear music, I feel invincible. When I hear music, I feel invincible. And so this is part of the building the spirit and the esprit de corps for the civil rights movement. People are going out to face possible death, to face, losing their jobs and their livelihood, to face, beatings and injury and insult. The movement not only spreads a message, but it also, strengthens our souls.
What are you excited about that's happening right now?
I'm thrilled about the global school strike movement. I just think it's absolutely the type of kind of direct action. If you remember the four things I mentioned, I said to build these movements, we need the power of dream, the power of story, the power of art, and the power of action. So I very much believe in direct action. I believe in civil disobedience. I believe in coming from a place of creativity and humor and compassion. But there's no substitute for action as well. I think sometimes folks get a little too spiritual where they feel like any kind of action is angry and is not spiritual. And I just kind of reject that. I think we need to act. Gandhi said there's nothing on this earth has ever been done without direct action. And oftentimes I will say it's people that are a little bit insulated by privilege. Not always, but oftentimes I find the people that think any type of critique or any type of action is just angry and is just setting up an us versus them. No, we can avoid an us versus them. It doesn't mean we otherize people. And we need to act in solidarity with, because I think when people, folks, particularly folks who are insulated by privilege, want to reject anything that feels like it's actually going to do something, it's a way of, and then they justify it with a kind of spiritual pose. They say, like, oh, well, I understand that I am the oppressor and I am one with the oppressor and there is no us versus them. Yes, these are all deep spiritual truths. But if that's going to keep you from taking any kind of action, from taking any kind of tangible steps to transform our society because you think you're so spiritual that you're one with the oppressor, well, I think you're ignoring your responsibility to the oppressed and to these marginalized communities. So I think that these are very complicated issues and that there's a lot of nuance, and this is a spiritual process of discernment, to understand I'm not getting into an us versus them, but I'm not going to do nothing either, right? So I'm thrilled. So I think this global school strike movement and just the brilliance of these young people, when I see, 50,000 young people marching in Berlin, when I see tens of thousands of young people marching in Australia, when we just had this global climate strike on the week of September 20th to the 27th, and by the end of the week, 7.7 million people have demonstrated and protested and marched around the globe. I think this is very important. And marches is not, gonna, get all the transformations we need, but this is part of the process by which we put pressure on the political and economic systems, right? So I'm just thrilled by the global school strike movement. I'm also thrilled by the intersectional analysis of these young people. For instance, Jamie Margolin is one of the co-founders of a group called Zero Hour, or This Is Zero Hour, and one of their recent campaigns is called Get to the Roots. Get to the roots of the climate crisis. And what Zero Hour is doing, they're going around giving these workshops. And she published something that was in The Guardian just a couple of months ago, where she laid out this analysis where she said the roots of the climate crisis are patriarchy, white supremacy, colonialism. That just stirs my heart, because that's the kind of analysis I've been advocating, for 20, 25 years. And she's doing it much more concisely and much more powerfully and much more brilliantly than I ever have. So I feel almost, it almost makes me tear up and feel like, okay, my work is done. I mean, not really, I'm going to keep engaging in my work, but you get the point. I'm going like, these young people have this analysis of the deep roots of the climate crisis in white supremacy, patriarchy, and colonialism. That is exactly the type of deep analysis that we need to transform these oppressions and social injustices and move into a beautiful future of equality and democracy and racial justice and gender justice, etc.
Can you share more about how that analysis helps us to move into a beautiful future?
Kind of along the lines of, my gentle critiques of some of these spirit, because I love all these people to death, and I consider myself a new ager at heart and a hippie at heart and all these things. So I understand a lot of these things where people say, well, we don't want to use negative language and we don't want to be too negative. But again, I think this is where the Buddhist term discernment, I think is really, really important. We need discernment. And there's a way in which, if we're just focused on kind of light and positivity and just imagining the world we want and the power of attraction, there's a way in which that can bleed into a form of denial and denialism. And that's why I say it's instructive that it's oftentimes people, it's not always, but oftentimes people who are insulated by privilege, who don't want to take a deep look at the roots of white supremacy. This is a horrific reality that has been unfolding on the North American continent for over 5 centuries. And we're not, I don't think, it's like James Baldwin has a great line where he said, not everything that's faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced. And so I kind of believe strongly that we need to really look at these deep realities of, and not dwell on them and not get stuck. And this is where again, it gets into these kind of new agey critiques of, oh, that's a victim mentality and this and that, like, well, there's a line to be walked. But I think the big problem is denial. And that is very conscious and on the part of the political and economic and educational systems. The system, the media system, the education system, the political and economic systems does not want to, for obvious reasons, dwell on anything that will call their own power into question. And so, particularly in the United States, there has been, but it's beyond the United States. There has been a tendency to minimize the significance and the ongoing impact. I mean, if it was all in the past, then I think you could make a case that, that's all in the past. Let's move forward. Let's look ahead. But it's not in the past, of course. The dynamics of the past are functioning and being perpetuated in the present. And so it's not about looking back, and it's not about the blame game. It's about actually coming into, and this is again why I think of this as a very spiritual process. Denial is the opposite of spirituality. Spirituality is awareness. Spirituality is clarity. Spirituality is having the courage to look fully at what is happening in the present moment, right? It's about being present, right? What's happening in the present moment. Gandhi said spirituality is absolute fearlessness. Gandhi said that fearlessness is a prerequisite to ahimsa and nonviolence, right? So I think of taking a hard look with compassion, with humor, with an understanding of nuance and complexity, with a recognition of the ways that we can fall into these traps of blame and us and them and finger pointing. With all of that, I think we need to take a really hard look at white supremacy, at patriarchy, at misogyny, at toxic masculinity, at rape culture, at militarism and nationalism. And so this is, again, when I talk about the power of dream, the power of story, right? Looking at the ways that racism and patriarchy and militarism and classism are stories, right? They start as stories. I mean, these are actual systems and institutions that impact the lives and the potential and the bodies of targeted groups and marginalized communities, right? But they do emerge and are perpetuated and are often sustained by story and narrative, right? So recognizing in the same way that we can look at kind of the modern Western story that's separated us from the planet and makes us think that we are superior humans, separated from nature, walking around on top of nature. So we can look at the power of story and worldview and cosmology in terms of the ecological crises. We can also look at story and narrative and worldview and cosmology when it comes to white supremacy, when it comes to homophobia and transphobia, when it comes to ableism, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that this is part of what it means to be engaged spiritual being on the planet at this time. I mean, everybody's got their different approach, and I believe in many, many different roles to play. And I believe that the artist that focuses on his or her work, or the mystic that focuses on his or her, meditations on the mountaintop, that all of these have a role to play. I don't say like everybody's got to do this and everybody's got to behave in this way or that way, but I think we need, a spectrum of responses to what it means to be engaged and conscious and in community and responsibility on the planet at this time. And I certainly think that serious critiques of, and it takes, a certain big-heartedness, particularly if you're insulated by privilege. I mean, I'm a white male, mostly heterosexual, middle class living in the United States. So I have so many vectors of privilege. And so to not go into defensiveness, to not go into denial, to not go into tone policing. Like, I'm only going to listen to these critiques if they're voiced in exactly a way that feels palatable to me, So I think this is an ongoing process of learning and commitment. And I think that, critiques of white supremacy, patriarchy, colonialism, all of these other aspects of injustice are important parts of what it means to have an open heart and an engaged soul at this time.
Yeah, and I think to embrace the fact that we're all in a different scale of this place of privilege. And yet, unless we're in that 1%, we're all victims right now of a system that does not serve humanity,
Right.
and that does not serve the depths of our souls and the possibilities of the most abundant, beautiful future. Acknowledging that part of us does not make us weak, and doesn't mean that now we're like in victim consciousness and blah, blah, blah. It's like
Right.
that actually acknowledging that can be a driving force to look into, okay, where am I being asked to rise up? Like, what is my way of activism at this time? Yeah, it's very interesting. Like I find the conversations that are happening now around privilege, and just this categorizing of privilege that everyone's doing now in conversations.
Right.
Like that wasn't happening 6 months ago, let alone a year ago.
Yeah, right.
You know?
Yeah.
But now it's like everyone has to say, like, caveat, I am, know, I am a woman of color. I was brought up in the United Kingdom. So here's where my privilege is, here's where my oppression is, here's my scale. Like, it's kind of amazing that we're looking at ourselves and at each other in that way, and we're making that more visible. And then within that, I think it's that there's this actually like an art of finding the expression of our creativity and our activism that fits that unique position that each one of us has come into this world in.
Absolutely. I had a professor once, and she said, your responsibility usually lies fairly close to your relation to history, by which I mean, I think she meant like your situatedness. I mean, your work is the way you're situated in the world. It's different than the way I'm situated in the world. You're from the UK, I'm from the US. We have all these different aspects that you're talking about. Yeah, I do think it's almost like a creative process to find out where you fit and what your expression and what you're called to do in terms of an activist in the world. Or, I don't even like the term activist that much. It kind of weirds me out a little bit, but I just think that we're all called to be healers, that we're all called to be compassionate members of a community, that it is similar to finding your own creative expression, your own unique voice. I mean, what's one person's calling is not going to look exactly like another person's calling. There's different movements and groups and issues that might say, oh, this is the most important, that's the most important issue. So I think it takes, some kind of it's a creative process.
Yeah, because if we get too caught up in needing to be present at everything,
yes,
then we'll burn out as well, and maybe not be effective at any of those things. And so there is that balance as well of... Absolutely.
Humans have a tendency to be a little too hard on themselves, so a lot of us are self-flagellating, or it's never enough, it's never good enough, or I'm a hypocrite because I drove my car today. It's like we're all caught up in this system. We all are finite beings with a limited quantum of energy and ways to express it. And the world is, the traumas and the griefs and the sufferings of the world are going to be overwhelming a lot of the time. So we have to have compassion for ourselves as well.
And boundaries and discernment.
Yep.
And knowing today it feels right to go and join that demonstration. But tomorrow I'm going to go for a walk in the woods and write a poem.
Yep.
If a poem graces me.
Yeah, right. Right. Yeah, that's well said.
Hello, this is Amisha. We are just taking a little break from the conversation here. On behalf of myself and the team, I want to say thank you for being part of creating a beautiful future. We make this for you so that we will all have the vision, wisdom, and activism we need at this time to weave a new narrative. Can you help us with this? You can do that by making a monthly donation to the podcast to cover our costs. Just the equivalent of a fair trade banana you might eat or a chai latte you might drink whilst you listen to this will make a huge difference to us. Head to www.thefutureisbeautiful.co/community to become a monthly patron. And the other thing is to tell your friends about this podcast so they can tune in too. Send them a message or post on social media and let them know what you love about it. And whilst you're at it, leave us a review. And now, back to the conversation. Thank you for your loving beauty. Is there anything else you'd like to share before we end with a poem?
I'd love to hear some more of your thoughts in terms of what got you interested in these types of, I'm fascinated by all the things that you're bringing together and exploring in your in this podcast series of conversations. I'd love to hear a little bit about what brought you into this.
Sure. It's one of those questions that's so big.
Yeah, right.
I don't know which part to share, but I guess the simplest answer in the context of what we've been sharing in this conversation is that this is where I've found the place where I can bring the different aspects of myself, of the dreams, of the stories, of the action, and what was the other one?
Dream, story, art, and action.
And my art, right? Yeah. That this is the place where it comes together for me. I guess my whole adult life, my childhood life was kind of split into two phases of like the kind of creative dreamer and then the wild, disconnected rebel in a lot of pain. And so there were those sections. And then from like the moment of adult life, I had a series of near-death experiences between 19 and 24. I was studying politics. And so very much in the world of creating change in the system. And I was doing a lot of volunteer work. My creative longing was crying, like it had been abandoned during the wild years, and it was asking to come back in. And as a result, I don't know, I've just found myself curious to talk to people, curious to create those spaces of depth and complexity, and those spaces where those parts of our soul and our hearts and our minds that get so little airtime in Instagram, Facebook, rushing around culture. I guess I've just been starving because there's been that longing and that craving, and because similarly to you, that relationship between the creative and the social justice has always been there for me. And one of the things that I've done is in my life is I created a jewelry label, and I did it as ethically and sustainably as was possible at that time with the way that supply chains were set up. And I created a whole story around the elements of worth and well-being that I wanted these pieces of jewelry to feel for the women that wore them. It combined the spiritual and the mystical through like the alchemy of the different crystals that were together, and then it combined like my love of the aesthetic and style and the beauty, in something precious. I guess that's just always how things form for me. If I if I let myself create and see, and I'm always really interested in experiences that allow that connection through our hearts and our minds and our whole bodies, into action. Yeah. Those are the experiences that have moved me the most. And then with that, I've been wrestling with, I guess, having not gone to art school and like been around the creatives, I've been wrestling with finding my place in a kind of world that most of my I studied politics at university, and then I've been working in politics and sustainability and social entrepreneurship in very like practical places, but with this very like tender heart. And so I don't know, this just feels like the time where those things have come more together in myself. Like they've always been there, and I've always been maybe more siloed in my understanding of myself, but not actually in any of the expressions. And so, for example, with my jewelry label, it was a political and a creative project. And I still thought I was in the spiritual closet. And then, of course, I was not. It was obvious. So yeah, I'm interested in where all these aspects come together. I'm interested in that being the key to the future, right? Like we're living at 20% or something of our brain capacity. That's just our brain capacity. Like I'm living probably at 5% of my like physical power. Like, I mean, I don't know, like in some ways I think I'm doing really well. Like these legs have been driven over by a 4-wheel drive pickup truck and they have healed. So like, that's miraculous. But like, I don't know, like if I would survive like an Ironman challenge or something. So, you know, I'm like, there's all this untapped potential everywhere, right? There's the untapped potential in letting ourselves feel in our emotional world, in our emotional expression, in our allowing ourselves to be moved by life and by each other. There's just so much untapped potential everywhere. And I feel like if we can activate more of that in all these different ways, and maybe some of us only have to activate it in one way, and then we form communities where the different parts exist in each other. Maybe some of us have to really like activate it in lots of ways simultaneously. But I feel like that this is the way that we get towards creating a beautiful future. That's where just having that courage to recognize that we're more than we've been told that we are, to recognize that our place is bigger than where we were put and what we were told. And then we use that and we challenge the system and we change the system. We create whole new worlds that make the system kind of fade, you know? And so for me, like the expressions of that right now are in different ways. It's in writing, it's in these conversations, which I love because they're alive. And because I've been on a personal challenge in my own journey with this, to not get caught up in like, I need to like have done all this research and I need to have read everything this person's ever written and all their influences, and I need to like have 5 pages of notes, and like seriously, how, you know, I pay to make this podcast. Like, how is that possible? And so then trusting in actually, no, I just need to show up in presence and allow the alchemy of me and the alchemy of you to create something into the world that is exactly what whoever happens to be listening to this needs to hear in this moment. And then that gives you the chance to say something that you've never said before. It gives me the chance to say something that I've never said before. We are receiving, catching that genius, right? Expressing. And so I feel like this little podcast in itself is a space of all of these things being alive. And I love the aliveness of it. And I love to hold space for others in the activation of all of this aliveness through the workshops or the online community that I'm hosting. And my own journey has not been easy, despite all the privilege that I've had. Like, I grew up in England. I went to private school for half my education. I went to a good university. I have been at dinner parties with relatives of the prime ministers or, whatever, and yet still within that, I've struggled so hard to find my place. I've struggled so hard to make my living. I've struggled so hard to get the book deal, to kind of find that space where there's that thriving for whatever that is that I'm bringing. Yeah, and I think that part of it is just because that space of envisioning, that space of opening up to our deepest possibilities, that space in wanting that relationship with the mystic inside of us, it doesn't fit into the commercial models of our current society. And it can, if it's watered down, if it's marketed in a certain way. And I haven't really ever felt comfortable doing that. But I believe that things are shifting, and I believe that there's a really deep hunger for depth right now. That's what I'm here to serve in myself, because honestly, if I don't, the depression, it's like I'm not even here, And I feel like for me, that's what beauty is, it's knowing the deepest darkness of this place. And then through that courage, knowing that the deepest joy that's possible. And then walking this life on this mysterious, chaotic place that takes me constantly between them, and means that I'm in touch with both aspects at all times, and some more than others. And despite having a spiritual practice, a yoga practice, a meditation practice, a creative practice, an activist practice, still being so capable of feeling the overwhelming horror that it is to be a human right now, and the despair and the loneliness, and then feeling just the utter bliss of being here, and how blue that sky is right now, and the pinkness of those flowers, and that look in your eyes, Yeah.
Wow. Magnificent. I know that was just a small glimpse, but that was really powerful and moving. And thank you for sharing that. This conversation has been really nourishing. I think you're right. There's such a hunger. This has been a great source of nourishment for me.
Yeah, for me too. Thank you.
Should I finish with a poem?
I'd love that. And just to share as well that with this podcast, there's so many people that could be on it. And I have, oh, it needs to have more of this, or it needs to have more of this, or whatever. And then the reality is that in this, there's so many names that kind of get suggested, or people that write in, or people that are on my radar. And then what I find is the ones that happen are where something else kind of it's like they just want to happen. And in this particular scenario, you appear at the house that I'm staying at on the second night that I'm there to read some of your poems. And then the next day we bump into each other at Bioneers. At one point, Nina Simmons says your name. Because there's a video with a quote part of Hieroglyphic Stairway, and she re-says it. And then a mutual friend suggested you and had wanted us to meet. And then I'm like, oh, yeah, we already met. And all of that happens, within a couple of days. And then you're like, oh, okay, this one's happening. It's got its own energy.
Fantastic. I love it. I love it. This is another short poem called We Make Music. I think it touches on some of the themes of cosmology and creativity that we've been talking about. We exist amidst the scattered shards of shattered stars. We exist amidst the scattered shards of shattered stars, and we make music. We rock on this rock. We flow on this globe. We go from Muddy to Buddy, from Janice to Alanis, from Charlie Parker to Ali Farker, from Artie Shaw to Mardi Gras, from Madonna to Rihanna, from Raga to Gaga, from Ode to Joy to Soldier Boy. The earth was once lava and now sings opera. Our home is a poem. The planet is a sonnet. We exist amidst the scattered shards of shattered stars, and we make music.
Thank you. When you read this the other night, you shared a little bit about the cosmology part, and you shared a little bit about Stonehenge and some of the sites of the UK and Ireland. And I just wonder, maybe this conversation is not ready to finish yet.
Yeah, right.
that just as a bridge, because so much of the community that listen to this show is in that part of the world, if you could share your
Absolutely.
kind of take and your interest, like why that fascinates you. Because also sometimes as humans, we are not very good at noticing the miracles on our very doorstep.
That's right. That's right. Well, I was telling you before we started recording that I've been a little bit obsessed with Scotland and also, you know, the whole of the UK. And part of why is, I mean, I love the people, I love the landscape, I love that it's different than, you know, the United States. I mean, if I had grown up there, I might be fascinated and wanting to spend more time in the United States. But having lived,
well, here I am.
Exactly. So, but part of my fascination has to do with this Neolithic culture, this megalithic culture. You know, I'm not an expert by any means, but I have been reading pretty intently about this for the last 2 or 3 or 4 years. And the little bits that I've gleaned is, you know, there's something like 900 to 1,000, the remnants of about 900 to 1,000 stone circles and standing stones and stone rows and, you know, what they call passage tombs and this type of thing. And so, you know, and this is not a huge area that we're talking about in Scotland and England and Wales and Ireland. And so, and those are just the remnants of the ones that we found. I mean, there's thousands more that have never been discovered, have completely been lost to history. Some have been deconstructed by people who use the stones to make villages and houses and stuff like this. But we're making new discoveries all the time. You may have heard cleverly called Dronehenge, but they just found around the area of Newgrange, which is a massive passage tomb in Ireland, because of the drought conditions of last summer, the summer before last. They found a whole new, several stone circles, particularly a big, massive one that was only revealed because of the drought conditions. And this guy happened to be flying a drone during some of the most extreme days of the drought. And now they know of a whole new, massive stone circle near Newgrange. And so they're called that Dronehenge. Part of what it means to me is that there was an immense ritual landscape that covered the UK and Ireland, and that they were doing ritual processions and ceremony, you know, and so like there's a connection between the massive stone circle at Avebury and Stonehenge, right? And they would be doing ritual procession. I mean, a lot of this is shrouded in mystery, and we don't know exactly what they were doing and, you know, what kinds of ceremonies and rituals, and if there was human sacrifice and other things that we would probably not be too excited about these days. But just the idea of creating a massive spiritual landscape. You know, I mean, the landscape is inherently spiritual because the earth is sacred and every blade of grass is sacred, but at bringing their human creativity and capacities for communion and celebration and their astronomical knowledge, and so enhancing the spirituality of the landscape. So you have this immense spiritual landscape that covered Britain and Ireland, and doing these ritual processions. So the last time I was in Scotland, I went to the Calanis stones on the Isle of Lewis on the west coast of Scotland. It's sometimes called the Stonehenge of the North. But, the way the moon rises behind, there's a relationship between the stones and the horizon, right? And so these mountains in Calanus, it's thought that the way the moon rises out of this, this one kind of silhouetted horizon line is considered like a goddess figure. And the moon arises out of the kind of the belly of the goddess and then ends up in the midst of the Calanus stones. And so these, almost all of these were astronomically aligned. So such that the monument, the stone circles, the stone rows, the standing stones are oriented toward the solstices and the equinoxes and the rising of certain constellations, and even the 18.6 year cycle of the moon, known as the major lunar standstill, and the minor, so every 18.6 years you have the major lunar standstill, which is where the moon rises farther north on the horizon, on the eastern horizon, than it ever does, except for this period of time every 18.6 years. And it goes higher across the sky than it ever does, except for at this 18 points. And then 9 years later, you have the minor lunar standstill. And it swings in a 2-week period. It'll swing from its most northern rising point on the eastern horizon to its most southern rising point on the eastern horizon. So you have these wild, dramatic, for these Neolithic people that were very attuned to exactly where the sun is rising, exactly where the moon is rising, to have this event happen regularly every 18.6 years, where within 2 weeks it swings from its most northern rising to its most southern rising. That's why it's called the major lunar standstill. And then 9 years later, there will be the minor lunar standstill, where it'll swing between where the swing is at its most narrowest extremes. So that's called the lunar minimum and the lunar maximum. I barely understand half this stuff, but you can tell I've been reading a little bit about this. So, so these were not just aligned to the solstices and the equinoxes, but to the 18.6 year cycles of the major lunar standstill. That indicates to me that this was a culture that very much understood its cosmological embeddedness and the mystery of that, and wanting to derive meaning and joy and ritual and ceremony and celebration from its communion with the cosmos, and the divinity of the sky and all of these things. And so to me, I think part of what's fascinating about it to me is that in the modern West, like we've talked about, we've lost this sense of cosmological embeddedness. Nature is a machine. It's mechanistic. It's materialistic. This is kind of the Cartesian, Newtonian, mental, rational, reductionist, logical, positivist worldview, where nature is a random aggregation of molecules and amino acids that is completely meaningless, and we are all individuated billiard balls separated from each other and separated from the cosmos, and the cosmos is separated from meaning. So I think there's something very powerful and poignant and profound about trying to learn more and recover some connection with the sense of cosmological embeddedness that it would take to be profoundly aware of the 18.6 year cycles of the moon. And of course, it's not just in the UK and Ireland. You have in the Southwest, the Native Americans in New Mexico in the Southwest also have petroglyphs that show that they were very much aware of the 18.6 year cycles of the major lunar standstill, and in Africa, and in the Middle East, and in Turkey, and in the Americas, and in Mayan architecture and astronomy. So it really points toward a kind of global astronomical ritual culture using these standing stones and these, pyramids and this sort of thing. So I find it fascinating and intriguing and mysterious, and really speaking to the kind of cosmological embeddedness that we could be moving back toward. And so I will read the poem that you're thinking of is one of the other short poems I read that night. So I'll read this one that was again inspired by. And so at the passage tomb of New Grange, these are called passage tombs because they have a long corridor that leads to a central chamber. That's the passage, right? And so at New Grange, the way that this massive passage tomb is oriented is toward the door is points toward the rising point of the sun at the winter solstice. And so only on the 3 or 4 or 5 days around the winter solstice does a shaft of light shine through what's called the roof box or the letter box above the door. So this is a specially constructed opening or aperture that allows a beam of sunlight only at the time of the winter solstice to shine down the 62-foot passageway and illuminate the central chamber. And so this happens at Newgrange. And for years, just as a quick side note, when some of the first kind of archaeoastronomers, folks that are into what was now called the field of archaeoastronomy, it goes back several centuries, but particularly in the 20th century, and then more recently, like in the 60s, you have people like Alexander Thom. And so when the archaeologists completely dismissed this, said, oh, it's absurd. The ideas that they were doing, orienting these things toward the equinoxes and the solstices and the major lunar sands. So these were Neolithic farmers, who could barely, gather enough wheat to make it through the winter. There's no way that they were doing these complex, astronomical and cosmological construction projects. And so a lot of these people were considered heretics, and you don't really know about archaeology, and we're the real archaeologists. And now, 50 years later, the tables have completely turned, and people are going like, oh, wow, there's some of these claims may have been exaggerated at first, but there's actually much more to this than we thought. And so the whole field of archaeology, mainstream archaeology, has had to kind of eat its hat over its dismissal of what these Neolithic peoples were doing. We're all geniuses all the time, and these people were expressing their genius through and their connection to the cosmos and their understanding of the movements of the sky and the heavenly bodies, through these massive, and building community and strengthening social bonds. And we don't need to over romanticize it. There may have been some hierarchy and some, all of these different things, and maybe people didn't want to, haul these massive stone megaliths 42 miles across the landscape. So I'm sure there were problematic aspects of this culture too, but it's completely fascinating to learn more about. So I'll read this poem that I wrote that was inspired by some of these standing stones and stone circles and passage tombs. This is called Midwinter. When midwinter sunrise shines down the passage tomb, how can we not dance? How can we not live again? When the breathing light of the nearest star illuminates the bowl of bones, how can we not dance? Sing our dead across the river of souls. Come into the consciousness of clouds. Come into the consciousness of megalithic structures, the frequency of the flickering flame, the blushing sky, the naked night, the psychedelic stars. Taste communion. The substance of the universe, this is my body. The consciousness of galaxies, this is my blood. When the living God that is the sky makes elaborate patterns, kiss and the stars show their fiery wings, how can we not dance? How can we not live again?
Thank you. A real pleasure to share this time with you.
Same here. Thank you so much.
And just to share your website, and Lucy White, who works on the show, is going to have some fun putting all of the references to everything that you've mentioned.
Good luck, Lucy. Thank you. And thank you.
But we will do our best to reference everything that you've mentioned. And and then your website.
Sure. My website is drewdellinger.org. So www.drewdellinger.org, drewdellinger.org. And I'm on Twitter at Drew Dellinger.
And is there anything else that you just want us to know about planetize the movement?
Yeah, I've got a small project, Planetize the Movement. That's mostly been my kind of advocacy and arts activism and speaking project. So I go around and I offer workshops and talks and things like that. Planetize the Movement is the name of that. And I've got a poetry book, Love Letter to the Milky Way.
Beautiful. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really, it's been a real treat.
Thank you for spending your precious time with us. As always, you can find links to everything we mentioned in this episode, download our book, and discover so much more over on the blog. We don't believe in selling you things you don't need through this podcast, and so it's made possible with you, our community. If you loved this and would like to fund our show with a monthly donation or join our online group to connect with other listeners, please visit www.thefutureisbeautiful.co and click on Community and Support. Please also share with friends, hit subscribe, and leave us a review so we can grow. Those gold stars really help others find us, so these ideas can spread. Here is to us, creating a beautiful future together. The Future is Beautiful is made by an all-female team working voluntarily or on reduced rates until our listener support grows. If you have been moved by anything you heard here, please donate the equivalent of buying us a drink. All donations make a huge difference to us and will allow us to keep doing this and remain advertising free. Until next time, I leave you with this question. How will you create beauty in the world?